Hey everyone, my name is Chris Trondsen. I'm a licensed therapist here in the state of California. I treat individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder and related disorders such as body dysmorphic disorder, as well as anxiety disorders. And I'm also a therapist that happens to have OCD. So I am a therapist that treats it, but also lives with it.
Maybe let's start with what does that even mean? What do we mean when we say queer affirming or LGBTQIA plus affirming care in OCD?
Yeah. When we talk about LGBTQ plus affirming care in OCD treatment, opening up to a therapist, I believe, is one of those most vulnerable experiences. You're sitting down with somebody across from you, and you're really just opening up about some of the inner thoughts and feelings and experiences that you have. Additionally, when seeing a clinician for OCD, some of those thoughts can be taboo. They can be stigmatizing and embarrassing. So you want to make sure that the person sitting there with you, working with you intimately, is somebody that you can open up to and trust. One of the fears that I know many of us who are queer that go and seek out mental health care is we're worried. We're worried sometimes that the person sitting across from us doesn't validate our lifestyle. They have judgments and it could impact our care. So LGBTQ affirming care is working with a clinician that sees you, hears you, and validates you. They're not going to use that as a negative judgment or a reason that they make decisions. Sometimes individuals seeking out OCD care are not there because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, yet some clinicians that don't work with this community will start to use that, whether it's their gender identity or sexual orientation, as the cause or root of their problems, when in fact that's maybe one of the things that actually makes the client happy. So there's tangible things you can do. Obviously, respecting someone's pronouns, not using super gendered language, not assuming the client sitting across from you is heterosexual or cisgendered. I believe it's more than that. I think things like putting it on your website that you're an affirming clinician is great and it's important, and there's more. At the end of the day, you want your client to feel comfortable and that who they are is not seen as a negative aspect, so that when they open up about those beliefs and sometimes in OCD, those taboo feelings that they experience, they don't have to censor or they don't have to worry that the person across from them is making judgments. I would say that one of the best things about working with a therapist is that person is going in without judgment and really giving you a safe space to open up. And that has to be for our community and the LGBTQ community as well.
Are also these kind of intangible things, right? Like we, as individuals that are queer or part of the LGBTQ community, both deserve and benefit from being able to access um, equitable care. And so, kind of like what you were saying, like we all deserve to, seek healthcare in a setting that makes us feel like we have an unbiased party. And so, I think I love how you also kind of connected that with the shame that comes up with OCD, because I think that OCD involves more shame necessarily than like your average person. So I think often we already are kind of like starting at a place of experiencing more shame. And that's just one of the many ways that the OCD community and the LGBTQ community overlap, is that experience of shame. Unfortunately, one of them is kind of created mostly internally, although certainly can be like externally influenced by how people respond when we share our intrusive thoughts or have shared them in the past. And then unfortunately, one of them is completely kind of culturally constructed and
Mm.
is kind of a reflection of the world that we live in and not necessarily of what's going on inside of us. But that can become really confusing. Just in general, that those of us with OCD are more likely to internalize that. Would you mind like talking a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'll actually use my own personal experience. The OCD, I was always what people call a people pleaser. My OCD
Okay.
experience was always to want people to like me and would be I had relationship OCD and not necessarily I did have it in a romantic relationship, but I also had it with people. I wanted to always make sure people liked me and they weren't mad at me, and I'd seek a lot of reassurance. And I know for me, outside of just like societal reasons, that as I started to recognize that I was gay, there was obviously fears about society opening up to family and how society will judge. But the way that OCD latched on to that for me in high school is it kept telling me, if people find out you're gay, they won't like you. You're going to disappoint them. They're going to, they like you right now, but then they'll be disappointed in that. You're going to disappoint people that you care about. You're going to disappoint family. And so besides just worrying about sort of backlash from others, I would have these intrusive, repetitive thoughts constantly. You got to figure it out. People have to like you. People have to this. And so I held on to a lot more, I think, like guilt. I almost felt like I was doing something wrong. Once the OCD subsided for it, I think obviously it shifted. I was really worried just about how am I going to fit into society when clearly people are making it very well known that they don't see the LGBTQ community as valid, and they, you know, sometimes take it even further. Feel like I'll never forget, I was in a class and one of my fellow students in college had written that you know, was writing about something about faith and stuff, and was saying like if they could have their way, all the queer people would go off to an island and just be able to live by themselves and leave the rest of us alone. So that was a different phase of just feeling very angry and hurt and stuff. But my OCD really latched on the way that I was potentially making other people feel uncomfortable because of my sexual orientation. In fact, it was a very loud thought when deciding to become a clinician. How would, you know, I like to work with all ages. So what if a parent finds out that I'm gay and doesn't want their child to work with me, or their teen or their young adult son? So there's a lot of just shame of who I was and guilt, and the OCD found that, latched onto it, and was really repetitive. And that was part of my journey through therapy, is working through those intrusive thoughts and just those feelings of guilt that I felt and experienced.
Yeah, I think that's so valid and so kind of meaningful. Thank you for sharing that experience. I have also kind of had my own lived experiences with some of those thoughts as well. So I've definitely had you know, the traditional, right? Like you're going to hell. So these really traditional kind of religious or spiritual scrupulosity intrusive thoughts that I think are really challenging to cope with, especially when they're also being kind of amplified or mimicked by the outside world. And so, you know, a lot of times our intrusive thoughts with OCD, like they feel very real to us. They're not necessarily always irrational, but so often they're coming from an internal place, right? Like we don't usually have people that are telling us externally, like, this is what is going to happen to you, or this is what you're going to do. And I think that some of these like sexual or sexual orientation intrusive thoughts, things like that, are actually like unique in that way, in that like we actually are kind of told by the outside world so often, yeah, you're going to hell. Another example, I think, is like kind of this healthy expression of sexuality, or this healthy expression and representation of romanticism being disgusting. And so I think it's really kind of a confusing message to send to those of us with OCD who are kind of like, how are we supposed to like really challenge being disgusted or being fearful of coming off as disgusting when we're actually being told, sent like messages explicitly from the outside world, that we are in fact disgusting, or that we are in fact broken, or that we are in fact, you know, different or alien, right? These are all like intrusive thoughts that those of us with OCD might have, but because we're queer, those thoughts are actually validated and reinforced so often. And so I think there's kind of that like double stigma that's happening, or just that reinforcement of some of these intrusive thoughts that becomes really murky, even in recovery or even in ERP. I think that can get really murky.
When I'm working, exactly, when I'm working with a client who has contamination, I work in an office that's around and surrounded by a lot of malls and parks, and I'll take them to a mall and we'll practice sitting on benches, opening doors, touching the items in the store. And one of the things I always can say to them in sort of like that education phase in the beginning is, look around. Do you see anybody else running away? Do you see anybody else in the same fear state? Why are you living with a different set of rules? And the client is able to start to recognize, as they get out and put themselves in new situations, you're right, everybody else seems comfortable. Why do I have to be so uncomfortable? The problem that happens when I work with clients in the LGBTQ community, sometimes they have, you know, faith is important to them as well. And they feel a lot of guilt and shame because their who they are as a person is hurting the church, or their pastor might be disappointed their family. When I'm working with a client, it's a lot harder to do that, because if I say, well, look around, you know, are there people that hate the LGBTQ community? Are there people saying you're going to hell, or you're bad, or you're grooming children? They're going to reply, yes. Actually, I hear it all the time. So with OCD, it's a little difficult because in the treatment, because there isn't just this sort of OCD world and then everybody else is living a different space. So it's trying to find, okay, how do we have the client identify what parts is OCD and what parts is just unfortunately our culture and political climate that we're dealing with. So there's a lot of extra work that goes into that because of how society is treating our community.
Yeah, that's such a great perspective. Clinician like yourself who is of diverse identities and also treats a lot of like diverse clientele. It's really, really cool and meaningful for me, a previous client and also a future clinician, to be able to kind of hear these really innovative ways that you've gotten around the system, really tried to bring people to that healing and that healthy place. Because what we know for sure is that OCD, anxiety driven thoughts, right, regardless of where they're coming from, are unhelpful. Like that's kind of by nature how OCD exists. If it wasn't disruptive, it wouldn't be OCD. And if it wasn't distressing, it wouldn't be intrusive thoughts. So yeah, I really appreciate that on a personal level. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one of the things that I sit with and talk to clients about is the difference between OCD or not. I love going back to the basics. So when somebody is experiencing hate from the outside world, let's say somebody finally feels confident to post a picture of them and their partner. And let's say somebody who previously was their friend, and maybe they're still on social media, but they haven't seen each other in a while. And somebody, DMs them and is like, oh my God, wait, you're gay, or, oh, you're queer, whatever, right? That isn't an intrusive thought, right? That isn't this unwanted sort of intrusive thought, image, impulse that pops up. And there isn't really a compulsion to do for that. It's more so deciding, are you going to block them? Do you want to respond? Do you not want to respond? Whereas if someone is sitting there and not wanting to post on their social media because they've invented in their head that people are going to say things hateful, etc., and they don't have any proof, their friends and their family are very validating and it might not happen, or it may happen, we don't know, but they're sitting there and worrying about it to the point that they delete their social media. They're like, I can't post anything. That's when we're starting to kind of have those intrusive thoughts, those catastrophizing thoughts, and those worst case scenarios dictating behavior. Now, it may happen. That's what's challenging. They may post something and then something happens, but they can respond to that when it occurs. That's the difference between OCD and not OCD, is when somebody who doesn't have OCD, an incident happens and then they respond. But for us with OCD, we already start inventing problems before. The other thing is finding that balance when I'm working with clients. If their exposure is to post a picture with their partner, and that's values driven, they really want to put that up, there may be a comment, and that's something we would talk. So sometimes clients might put something on private, or they might have like a Finsta where they'll post those pictures, but not on their general. So as a clinician, that's why it's so important to be validating and to understand different marginalized communities, is because there may be some things that are unsafe for your queer clients that aren't unsafe for your clients that are cisgendered or heterosexual.
Yeah, such a great point. Thank you for making that distinction. I think that clarifies a lot, because I think a lot of people, and this happens outside of Pride Month or outside of LGBTQ issues, but a lot of times people are like, well, I have that fear. Like, do I have OCD? Or like, wait, I might have OCD because I worry about that sometimes. And I love that you kind of highlighted a little bit of the difference there. I think that's really, really important to emphasize. I also love that you mentioned at the end there, like some things may be safe for your hetero clients or your clients who don't identify as part of the LGBT community that are not safe for your clients in the LGBT community. And so I would love to ask you, like, how do you know the difference as a clinician? How do you know the difference? And then how do you react?
Absolutely. One of the things about being a clinician in the LGBTQ community is some of that is just innate. I know what things that we do or just are that unfortunately seems to offend or anger people and gets our families to alienate from us or things like that. So whenever I'm working with a client, especially if their OCD is around things that may end up having them have problems with their family, a lot of that's innate. And because I do have my own, I have my own blind spots, right? Like I work with a lot of clients that are trans. I'm not trans myself. I cannot walk in with a trans client and be like, oh, I'm LGBTQ. I know everything they're going through, because I absolutely don't. So in our field, what I love about our field is continuing education. We want to get continuing education credits because we need to, to renew, but I will always pick whether it's OCD specific or general about marginalized groups that I'm not part of, so I can understand the best that I can. So I'm making sure that the things that I do with my clients keep them safe. But an example is I work with some teens and young adults that potentially, if their parents do find out about their sexual orientation or gender identity, they might be cut off or alienated. And I want to make sure that everything we do together in treatment is not putting them in an unsafe situation, sometimes based on somebody's work. I've worked with teachers that are now kind of afraid. Sometimes we have people that come from other states and do our IOP program. And I'll ask, I'm like, I just want to make sure, do you feel like your job is safe? I think we can get around doing certain things publicly if it's going to put you in that danger. So I like to ask those questions. I want the client to feel safe that whatever they do isn't going to then obviously bleed over into that. So it's always just kind of, recognizing that there's certain things that may not be safe. An example that comes to mind is that a client that wanted to be on a dating app. That was part of their OCD fear, is they had a lot of social anxiety kind of weaved in with the OCD, and they had a lot of responsibility OCD and didn't want to hurt people. So they felt really bad swiping. And the problem was that they weren't out. So they were afraid if they went on a dating site, how could that happen? So, we ended up coming up with a solution that worked for them. And that's why you got to listen to your clients. I said, okay, well, we know you want to date and you're worried about being on a public dating site. How can we get around that? So for us, what we found is there were meetup groups that were specifically LGBTQ specific for outdoor groups. And so the client felt comfortable doing that because they felt, look, if I run into somebody that knows me, it means they're in the community, versus putting themselves on a public site where somebody could see it, screenshot it, send it to other students, and then suddenly they're forced to be out. So it's being creative in a way that you can still get the OCD to be treated and make sure that your client isn't put in a situation that makes them uncomfortable outside of OCD.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really, really insightful. Thank you for sharing that. That makes a lot of sense. And I think what's really interesting is that, as a person who's been through OCD treatment myself, there was approximately a million things that I was like, this is unsafe. I feel unsafe. I'm so unsafe right now. And there's a huge difference between that experience that I had with OCD, which was real and valid, and then the experience that I have now in OCD recovery as a person in the LGBTQ community. And so I think it's really interesting because in treatment, a lot of that was go really hard, right? We overcorrect in treatment so that we can land somewhere in the middle. And so we're going to like really go at it as hard as we can and embrace the fear. And yeah, like you feel unsafe, like invite that in. Like we really want that, right? Like that's kind of where we want to be. However, if we have a client that comes in who's like, I'm really scared of getting hit by a car, we're not like, all right, let's go put you in the middle of the street and like
Right.
hope for the best, right? Because we don't actually want you to get hit by a car.
Yeah.
And so I think like what's really interesting about that is that we as clinicians and those of us who are clients, unfortunately, have to navigate this care and advocate for ourselves in a lot of ways maybe that others don't. As well around this idea of like what actually is safe, right? So like, yes, anything can always happen. We know that almost anything is possible. Most things in life are uncertain to some degree. And like there are some things that are happening, unfortunately, more common than others. Interesting kind of dynamic that we have to navigate between both as clients and as providers.
Absolutely. And that's why I always go back to the basics, because we do want to service our clients with the best OCD care that we can. And we know that things like reassurance or overestimating dangers or avoidances, things like that, are not helpful for the disorder. And we want to make sure that a client feels safe and it's in their value system. So the way that you really do that is you go back to the basics. Is this something that is likely? There's incidents happening? Is it something that the average person in that community, if I went up and talked to other people in the LGBTQ community, and then that's a good thing too, by being a queer clinician, I have queer friends. So if a client comes in and is worried about something and my friends are worried about it too, who don't have OCD, then there's probably a lot more going on there that's real life versus specifically OCD. And OCD has an amazing way of latching onto real life things and taking them to an unmanageable level. And I always tell that to my clients. I'm like, together we will find a manageable solution. And OCD is telling us it's unmanageable rather. So an example would be if a client was afraid of getting gay bashed, which is absolutely something that happens. If they're not leaving their house ever, then we know that OCD is taking it a little bit of an extreme. But if they don't feel very comfortable parking a few blocks away from a club, a gay club, especially if they're not in like a city like West Hollywood where it's a bunch of gay clubs, sometimes there's just a little ones here and there in a city. If they don't want to park 3 blocks away and walk by themselves at 2:30 in the morning, that's okay. That's not really a
Yeah.
value. It's okay to park closer or Uber or walk with friends. So once again, it's making sure that OCD doesn't take a situation that is real and blowing it up. And we know that, right? If somebody's not leaving their house or they're never dating, I think back to, I've worked with clients in this community that are worried about certain, STIs that are more prevalent with gay men. So then they just won't have sex. And so it's like, no,
Yeah.
there's ways to be safe. There's PrEP that you can go on. So there's ways to find a balance. We don't have to live in those black or white. Either I'm going to get HIV or I'm never going to have sex. We can find that in the middle. So that's why it's like knowing this community, being a clinician that's willing to be kind of like out of the box and not so rigid, and really just troubleshoot and individualize the treatment for the client. One of the assets that we have as clinicians is consultation. That was something that all of us in our master's programs heard a lot about, is as clinicians, we can do our best to be affirming and understand all different marginalized communities, different, ethnic backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds. And we're also human. We may not know everything about every community, but that's what's so great about consultation. That's one of the things I enjoy as part of my career is when clinicians do reach out and say, Chris, can I consult with you? I have a client in the LGBTQ community, and they are experiencing some things that don't necessarily feel like OCD to me. And I just want to navigate it with care and gentle and just really understanding. And then we'll consult. Obviously, they're not going to open up and tell me any identifying details. They'll generalize it, but we'll get our heads together and brainstorm. And often they'll reach back a couple weeks later and just say, thank you. Like, my client really felt heard and supported, and we were able to really tackle the OCD issue in front. So that's something that all clinicians, besides continuing education, which I know NOCD offers a lot for clinicians, there's also consult, find clients in certain groups that you might have a blind spot for, and they'll be, most of them, if they have the time, are more than happy to consult and give you some direction so that you make sure that your client is getting the best care they possibly can.
Absolutely. And I second that. And then, would also extend that to say like representation matters for exactly that reason.
Mhm.
The crux of diversity is being able to not just tolerate, but to actually embrace everyone's identities and utilize the strengths from each of those identities and those kind of communities. And then like we're all working towards the same thing, which is to help people. And in this case, to help people with OCD better navigate that. So that's very
That's one
cool.
of and that's one of the things, you discussing the importance of having diversity in our field is something that I love that the community in general, the mental health community, is moving towards. There wasn't a lot of diversity. There still isn't enough diversity. When I was getting treatment, there wasn't a lot of diversity. There wasn't very many discussions about individuals with OCD who are also queer. And there was plenty of situations I was in that I was uncomfortable and difficult to talk about. I experienced relationship OCD in my first relationship, which also was my first same-sex relationship. And I wasn't even open with my therapist about it because I was so afraid about her judgment. Now, she didn't give me any reason to think that, but there was also nothing that I knew about her that made me feel comfortable enough to open up. And it wasn't until it became too difficult to speak about without just finally opening up and saying, look, I have a boyfriend and this is what my OCD is fixating on. I want to focus on it, that finally we were able to do good work. And that's why letting clients know that you're affirming is important so they feel comfortable opening up and not having to skirt around certain things. I know when I first would go to conferences and people would lump up having intrusive thoughts around their sexual orientation, being in the same kind of categories as incest and the same as bestiality. That's something our community already deals with, especially being called groomers as of late. So I've loved that the community has gone from homosexual OCD to sexual orientation OCD. That was one of the things that I wanted to lead at the IOCDF. It was very important because people who are queer question their sexual orientation as well. And also it's different, having intrusive thoughts around harming a child is not the same as somebody experiencing thoughts about potentially being queer. It may shake up their life, of course, but it's not necessarily bad. And one thing that the community's been talking about a lot more lately is having intrusive thoughts around gender identity and recognizing that sexual orientation doesn't cut it at all, because there's individuals that don't question their sexual orientation, but they do their gender identity. So seeing these things expand, all it's doing is it's allowing more and more people with OCD to identify A, that what they're experiencing is OCD, and then B, getting the proper care. So I know sometimes there's people out there, especially if they're not part of a marginalized group, that get so offended with the word diversity. They hate it. They think it's something evil. It's like, if you really take a breath and see what it is, it just means that more and more people who are suffering are going to get care. And if all of us go into the field, this helping profession, that should be our number one goal.
Yes.
So
Yes.
people should be embracing this because it just means that more people are getting the care that they need and deserve.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad again that you made that distinction between kind of the more taboo, traditionally taboo sexual intrusive thoughts and gender identity OCD versus sexual orientation OCD. And you said you really wanted to like lead that movement, and you actually have, I think, because we are widely using the terminology now, sexual orientation OCD or so OCD. And even just 5 years ago, it was all HOCD. And, so making that change, I think, is itself quite significant. And it's something we're still going to continue working towards and really identifying what's that versus gender identity OCD. But even knowing that like you've had that impact on the community, I think is really, really cool and already like shows that your work really matters. Because like you said, like, I mean, I've had intrusive thoughts about not being gay enough. Like I've had intrusive thoughts about not really being queer and like am I actually straight, and just kind of lying to everyone that I know, right? So there's all of these things that come up that aren't necessarily centric around homosexuality or any particular sexuality in general. So yeah, I'm really glad that you kind of made that distinction, and just a lot of gratitude for the work that you've done in the community so far.
Thank you. It was important for me when I was asked to become a lead advocate and then eventually on the board of the IOCDF. They valued my diverse background when it came to my sexual orientation. And those were the things that I was hearing in the community. And it was really important to me so that people who are in the queer community know that they may also question, are they queer enough, or things like that. One of the things I work with a lot of different clients, for instance, is I'll work with a client that's bisexual and she may end up marrying a man, or she might be pansexual and marry a man who's cisgendered, and then think, okay, well, does that now invalidate that I'm also attracted to women? Like there's a lot of nuances. OCD wants things to fit in these perfect categories. And we know sexual orientation and gender identity isn't always going to fit in those categories. And so people with OCD may be happily married, but the OCD is like, are you queer enough? You said you were bisexual. Were you lying for I think society also is unfair to women who are queer. It's unfair to people that are bisexual, who are pansexual, because if a woman doesn't fit into that, like if a queer woman, let's say, is bisexual or pansexual and doesn't end up marrying a woman or marrying someone who's non-binary or trans, it's like suddenly, okay, well then maybe you're just really straight. It's just murky. The society is not doing us any favors as a community, and OCD hears that and latches on and has people question that. So if we haven't expanded the term to sexual orientation and gender identity OCD, there's a lot of queer people that are missing the OCD and aren't getting care for that. And that's why the expansiveness of that was important. Is there's a lot of people that struggle with that. I remember working with a client and wanting to uncome out because he's like, look, I found women attractive. I know in my own experience, I think women can be beautiful. I think non-binary people can be beautiful. I've found myself attracted. I'll see someone who is a trans male and I'll be like, man, he's really attractive. And in the beginning, now I know a lot more about OCD, but in the beginning, that really, really made me uncomfortable because the OCD is like, no, if you're gay, you have to be 100% gay. And all of these conversations are important because if we're not identifying this, somebody could be living with a subtype and not getting the help that they need. So I think it's important to open these conversations up to help people identify the different ways that OCD impacts us.
Yeah, no, I think that's so wise. I mean, the reality is like if OCD treatment has taught me one thing, it's that almost nothing is black and white. Almost nothing is 100% or 0%, and almost nothing is certain. Most of life, especially like the beautiful parts, happens in the gray. And so this is no different than that, right? Like our sexuality, our experience of romance, our experience of our gender, like these things are all fluid. And we know that. Like we are able to kind of understand these things are fluid and they are typically very oriented around our values. And so, what does OCD love more than something that's uncertain, fluid, can change over time, and something we really, really care about and associate with kind of who we are as a person? Like, it is no surprise that OCD is going to latch on to that wholeheartedly. And, like you said, kind of whether it's amplify very real lived experience fears or create, extra fears or extra obsessions and behaviors that might go along with that in that space. It doesn't surprise me in the slightest. How do you manage and do you work with clients who may not openly identify as part of the LGBTQ community? Perhaps they identify as hetero or just, don't identify as part of the community or queer, but they have obsessions around being gay or being queer, because I think there's a lot of conversation in the field right now about that, and I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, one of the things I love about this field, and in my master's program, man, they hammered it in. They really hammered it in, is that despite my beliefs and my values, it doesn't matter when you're working with a client, in the sense that it's client first. You put your client first always. And they warned me, they've let me know that you're going to work with some clients that absolutely are against your values, but they deserve all the respect, attention, and best care that we can. So I have worked with clients who have intrusive thoughts around being gay. I would say that was probably, of all the different ways that sexual orientation and gender identity show up, I would say the majority of times when people are negative towards my community is when they are cisgendered heterosexual, they identify that way, and they get intrusive thoughts about being gay, and they'll say some nasty things. They'll say, I don't want to go to hell, I don't want to get diseases, I don't want to be disgusting, and things like that. And I have to check myself. Obviously the gay part of me wants to stand up and be like, no, we're not like that. But once again, it's not about me. And I think that's something all of us as clinicians have to agree about going into working with people, is we're going to work with diverse people that have different belief systems than us, and they still absolutely deserve, they're human, they have a beating heart, they deserve to get care from this insidious disorder, however it shows up. So that's difficult. Now, I totally understand and respect. I have a lot of clients that come in that are cisgender and heterosexual and have nothing against the queer community, but are still dealing with a lot of strife over their sexual orientation or gender identity intrusive thoughts. So once again, it's not fair for me as a clinician to sit there and be like, get over those thoughts. The gay community is amazing. The queer community is amazing. If you are awesome, like, you should go to a pride parade, because the OCD is going deeper than that. That's why core fear identification is important. This person feels like their whole worldview and their whole identity and understanding of themselves is about to be flipped on top of their head, and that frightens them. They like the life they've lived, and OCD attacks the things we care about the most. So it's letting them know, don't be embarrassed. Don't feel bad that you're having fears around being part of the LGBTQ community. And I love the fact that you don't have anything against it. And I'm here to validate your experience. I see you're distraught. I see that you're unhappy. I see that it's troubling to sleep. But that's why I like to go back to the basics. Content after a while doesn't matter. You're struggling with intrusive thoughts, Theo, and you're dealing with compulsions. So let's work through that. Let's get you back to being yourself. So I work with two different types of straight heteronormative clients. Some of them have nothing against the LGBTQ community. It's all about thoughts about the opposite identity. And some who genuinely don't want to be in the community, and that's why it's their core fear. They think it's disgusting. They think that therapy is not a time for activism. Now, outside of my clients, right, I'm obviously going to always stand up and ride hard for my community, but in session we have to respect that. So we have to respect everybody's experience with OCD, because this is an insidious, terrible, disgusting, misunderstood disorder. So I'm always going to first and foremost make sure that people with OCD get the help that they need.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that's so helpful to kind of hear. I'm sure that'll be helpful for other clinicians as well in the community who are kind of navigating this now and trying to identify how it is they're supposed to be responding to this. What are your thoughts, if any, on like how you navigate ERP with either of those two categories of individuals, whether they are homophobic or not homophobic, and they, are experiencing those intrusive thoughts?
One of the things I used to see in the past from therapists who usually aren't part of the LGBTQ community is a lot of the exposures for, let's say somebody is straight and cisgendered, a lot of the exposures were really over the top.
Okay.
Things that I think is sometimes uncomfortable for not only the clients, but the community. And so I've worked with clients that have come to me and said, look, like, my past therapist made me sign up for a gay dating app and like go on dates with guys, repeated times, and like hold their hands and things like that. Now, that's probably against that person's values, but I think even more so, like, poor guy or girl or individual that they went on the date with, who's thinking they might have met their match, and really they're just kind of an experiment as an exposure. So the whole point of treatment is not to do fear factor and shock somebody. It's to invoke understanding of the disorder, learning, and changing the way that you live and respond to those thoughts and feelings. So, we don't have to put a skirt on a straight client and say, you have to go to the grocery store in a skirt and get stared at. That's not really the treatment. It's more so identifying, like, what are the things this person either does or avoids doing that's actually just just reinforcing the disorder. Now, an example would be, I told an example for a client. I was like, well, there's the Human Rights Campaign, and they have a sticker that you can buy, and it's just the blue sticker with the yellow equal sign, and it's sort of just a way of saying, like, I believe everybody's valid. That doesn't mean you're part of the community. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean anything. It's a sticker to support. And so putting that on a car might be anxiety provoking, but it's not crossing a line for values. A client might genuinely say, like, hey, if I was didn't have OCD, I would love to wear more tight-fitting clothes, or I'd like to do my hair a certain way, but the OCD says that that's going to make me gay. And it's like, okay, that's in your values. Let's go do that. You want that hairstyle. So I always say the best person who knows the best exposures to do is your client, because they know what they want to be doing but aren't doing to the disorder. So you can do a lot of exposures. I've never ran out of them for clients that don't have to then be hurtful to the LGBTQ community. I always imagine, like, would you feel comfortable doing that in front of like 15 gay and queer and trans people? And if the answer is no, then you probably shouldn't do it if it's going to cross that. I had one client who told me they worked with a therapist that didn't treat OCD, and he was like, you should probably go have sex with a guy, and afterwards, if you liked it, you're gay. If you don't like it, you're not. And that's not what we're supposed to be telling. And even outside of OCD, like, we shouldn't be telling clients to go do anything. We want to have them come up with how they want to live their life. So I think I've noticed, at least, that people have moved away from those like really non-justice based hurtful exposures. An example is like, there's areas here in California, like in Long Beach or West Hollywood, that are very queer. And I'll tell a client, like, go down there. They have queer coffee shops. Go grab a coffee. If you like coffee, go there, get coffee. That's still an exposure. They don't have to go there, meet somebody and hang out and lead them on for 15 dates while they're figuring out if they're gay or not. So there's ways to still be very effective in OCD treatment without hurting a community or having somebody go outside of their values.
Yeah, no, I love that. Thank you for sharing the examples, both the bad, the good, and obviously the ugly too, because I think it's important for us to be able to acknowledge these, and like, not necessarily in a way that we're shaming clinicians, right? Like, OCD treatment has for a while been experimental in nature. Like, we've really been working hard to identify what is effective, what's not effective. And I think for a long time, fear factor was the impression of what was the most
Yeah.
effective way to treat OCD. And so I love that you're kind of coming at it from an education perspective. And that's really what we're trying to do. Just help, these clients, all of these individuals who are in the community, struggling just like we've struggled in the past, get the best possible care that they can. Yeah.
Absolutely. And every field is going to evolve. And the cool thing is that before, I don't think marginalized groups were asked, because it's not just the LGBTQ community. I mean, I've had clients that worked with me, and they said, oh, their intrusive thought was that they might say something offensive to Black people. So the therapist was like, you should go to a mall heavily populated by people of color, the BIPOC community, and you should be whispering the N-word under your breath. And that would horrify me, because I'm like, that's not really treatment. That's just putting a client in a very uncomfortable situation, because that's not who they are and something that they would ever do. So there's ways, one of my favorite exposures for people that are afraid of saying something uncomfortable or offensive to the BIPOC community is to find a really cool BIPOC owned store and go support their business. Go in that store and buy something, but you don't need to be like saying offensive things under your breath or anything like that. So there's ways, once again, to do really effective education and building exposures that can still be justice based and support communities. I think it's absolutely ways of doing that. I have clients that are afraid maybe of being around somebody who is houseless, right? Homeless, and they're just like very afraid of that. Well, once again, we shouldn't be using them as props in our exposures, but let's go volunteer at a soup kitchen in a low economic area. Let's support that community and help, because you're doing an exposure and you're doing something values based, versus like going up to somebody who's houseless and like kind of like walking around them and then leaving. That person's like, what the hell, what's going on here?
Right.
Why are people just like using me as a prop in treatment? So we can just make
Right.
these slight different switches that make treatment justice based, and we don't have to have our clients reflecting 5 years later like, wow, I totally led this person on in this queer relationship to sort of just figure out if I was or not in treatment. We don't have to put people through that, and still can have effective treatments.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great point. And I love the example that you used with like an unhoused individual too, because it's the same thing, right? I mean, the same thing at the mall, all of these, I'm just like cringing as you're telling them because it's so
Yeah.
hard to hear as a client, as a future clinician. Like it's just, ugh, it's so hard. So I think like I love that we're at a space now where we can kind of say, like, hey, that's actually not necessary. Like we can actually recover from OCD. And arguably, that's not even the most effective route, right? So often, what we find is a really effective route is finding the middle path and trying that.
One thing I do want to make clear before I say the last piece, I also don't want people to feel shamed. I mean, when we're clinicians, we're doing the best for our clients. And we may reflect back and have done some of those exposures that probably weren't very justice-based. What we have to understand is the community has changed. The treatment field has changed. And it's all of our responsibilities as clinicians to be up to date with what's going on in our community. And there's conferences and there's trainings and there's things that NOCD puts out that are really, really effective. And it's not about shaming clinicians, because I know that people are out there doing their absolute best. So it's evolving. So I want to make that clear. I'm not shaming anyone. Some of these
Yes.
things, examples that I've given, I don't know that therapist, but I'm hoping that that therapist absolutely had their best interests at heart and just went about a way that maybe because they weren't part of the LGBTQ community, they didn't see it as hurtful like we might. So I just want to make sure that I do believe that most of us in this field, especially OCD specific clinicians, are doing their absolute best. So I want to make that clear. As for what I'd like to say, the LGBTQ community right now, it's hard. It is tough. This Pride Month and this year has felt like we have sort of been like the scapegoats. Our community has always kind of been kicked down and put down. It's just a lot more verbal, constant, and louder than it's ever been. And I know how OCD works. It's going to use what's going on in society and bring it and make it about you and start to put thoughts and images in your head, and it's going to bring up a lot more difficulty. And you got to remember the basics. You got to recognize that this treatment is here to get the OCD out of the loud noise. What I keep saying to all my clients that are in the queer community is life is already tough for us right now. We don't need OCD to go there and make it even tougher. So as someone that gets it, who's lived it and understands how difficult it is to navigate an identity that a lot of people see as harmful and hurtful and sinful and just disgusting, that's already so difficult as it is. Don't allow OCD to latch onto that. Find a clinician that either is part of this community or has done their work and is an ally to our community, so they get what you're going through and it can absolutely help you get better while respecting your identity. The last thing I want to say to clinicians is totally, totally, totally know that you might do or say something wrong, but we are a forgiving community. We know your intentions are best. You don't have to constantly apologize, but just recognize maybe what didn't work with a client, or if you misgendered a client or said something wrong, just own it, apologize, and move forward. We're human too. We're doing our absolute best, and we need clinicians out there. There's not enough queer clinicians for the queer community with OCD. So we need all clinicians to be able to do the work and to just consult or whatever it needs to be so you can be an ally and validating clinician. We need you out there so that our clients with OCD who are also queer can get the best care that they can. So my final thought to everybody for this Pride Month is it's tough. We will look back and know that June of 2023 was a tough one. I also look at the history. We have had so many people that have gone through this years before Allie and I are even born, years before you were even born, that have fought for our community to at least get us where we are. We're not a community that goes down easily, and we will band together, support each other, and get through it. And hopefully this will be the turning point, because I really, really know that the younger generation, especially, man, Gen Z has been such a good voice of support to the LGBTQ community. So looking at that just gives me a lot of hope. So hang in there for Pride Month. Thank you, NOCD, for having me. You are all doing amazing work, really working with insurance companies to get people care. And, just doing this for Pride Month and letting clients know that NOCD is a supporter of the LGBTQ community and just wants people with OCD in that community to get help. It's really impressive. So thank you for having me.